Now, while the Industrial Revolution is changing dang near everything in Europe and the conservative age of Metternich is in full force, lots of new political ideologies are beginning to spring up in the 19th century, and in this video we're going to talk all about it. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. By the way, if you want fill-in note guys to go along with this video, then check the link in the description. Now, it is hard to underestimate just how much social and political disruption Europe experienced at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century. Part of it was due to the massive shift in power and social structures that came along with the Industrial Revolution, and then part of it was due to the significant rupture in the status quo caused by the French Revolution. And yet another part of it was caused by the suppression of nationalist revolts by states during the conservative age of Metternich. And there are more causes as well, but you just need to understand that as the social and political ground under Europeans' feet began shifting significantly, many of them started cooking up and embracing new ideologies that demanded change. And the first ideology I want to mention is liberalism. Now, liberalism didn't arise out of nothing during this period. It was very much an Enlightenment idea. And you have to get out of your head all the contemporary connotations you have with liberalism in America. They're not the same thing. Classical liberalism emphasizes the individual and their natural rights. Additionally, it emphasizes popular sovereignty, which teaches that the power to govern is in the hands of the people. To that end, liberalism wants a limited government, which is to say not an all-powerful one. Liberalism also emphasized enlightened self-interest, which means that a person acting in the interest of society is ultimately acting in his or her own interest. And let me give you a couple names to associate with liberalism. First, the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Now, Bentham did his work before the period we're talking about right now, but his ideas very much set the stage for liberalism's flourishing in the 19th century. He developed a philosophy called utilitarianism, which argued that actions should be judged based on whether they increase the happiness of those affected by the action. This was a significant departure from Christian morality, which established actions as right or wrong based on scriptural sanction. For example, according to the Bible, it's always wrong to kill a person. But under the rubric of utilitarianism, if killing that person benefited society and increased people's happiness, well, kill him. Okay, now a second name to associate with liberalism is John Stuart Mill, who was kind of a disciple of Bentham and built on his work. Mill softened the edges of Bentham's utilitarianism and emphasized acting not only for the happiness of individuals, but for the society as a whole. Now, for the most part, liberals debated how far their principles should reach, and more specifically, to whom. In many places, liberalism shifted to the elite class, who prized it because it kept government regulations out of their business. And as such, they argued that fundamental rights like the right to vote should be limited to those who owned land because they were the ones with the real stake in society. In response to this, a movement in England known as Chartism pushed back. They demanded universal male suffrage and full citizenship without respect to wealth, title, or property ownership. And though their movement fizzled out despite their great efforts, by the mid-19th century, many of the reforms for which they fought would be won by other groups later in the century. Additionally, women seldom showed up in liberals' minds as being worthy of their reforms. However, John Stuart Mill bucked this trend with his book The Subjection of Women, in which he argued that women ought to stand upon equal ground with men. He argued that women should have the right to vote, the right to hold property, the right to work in professional careers. Over in France, a woman named Flora Tristan worked for the rights of workers and laid the foundations for extending suffrage to women as well. In other words, women weren't only good for making their husbands sandwiches, which was the prevailing view of the age. Okay, now another ideology springing up during this time was socialism, which, when being defined, is an ideology that demands that a society's means of production should be owned by the community as a whole, not by private individuals. Essentially, it called for a redistribution of a society's wealth, and this one emerged right out of the Industrial Revolution. For all the potential good it did, the Industrial Revolution made a few people fabulously wealthy and left the majority of people scratching out a bare living in factories earning low wages. And so socialism popping up in this context is not hard to understand. Now, there are a couple of species of socialism you need to know, and the first is utopian socialism, and the name to associate with that one is Henri de Saint-Simon. He taught that society ought to be given to the workers and taken from what he called the parasites, namely the aristocracy and the church, who produced nothing of value for the world. If the world's institution was in the hands of the workers, he argued, they would organize just societies in which there were no longer any poor. Now, the reason this is called utopian socialism is because the ideas were just a little too grand to ever work in reality, and Saint-Simon never led an attempt to do it. However, his writings were immensely popular and provided at least a template for later socialist movements. Even so, two of Saint-Simon's disciples, namely Charles Fourier and Robert Owen, did attempt to put these ideas into practice by creating what they called intentional communities. Their prototype community was established in Scotland, and its members enjoyed 8-hour workdays, shared property, and free education for the children. And despite the relative success of that community, the idea really never caught on in the rest of Europe. Now, the second species of socialism you need to know is called scientific socialism, which was the brainchild of Karl Marx. Now, Marx had some goals in common with the utopian socialists. He also was deeply distressed at the injustice of a society where there was such a large gap between the rich and the poor classes. However, Marx believed that the utopian socialist solutions failed because they didn't really understand how capitalism, that great enemy of the people, worked. Therefore, he aimed to produce a socialism that was developed according to the same rigor and standards that scientists use in their descriptions of the natural world. So Marx, along with Friedrich Engels published these ideas in an influential book known as the Communist Manifesto. And in order to understand what these men presented, you have to understand their view of history. According to Marx and Engels, history obeys laws just as the physical world obeys the laws of physics. Therefore, they argued that history moved through patterns and stages until one day it would reach its ultimate goal. To them, the driving force of history is class struggle over economic wealth. Industrialization had exacerbated the division between the two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and thus a new societal arrangement was necessary. The bourgeoisie owned the means of production and thus exploited the proletariat for their own benefit. And once the proletariat became conscious of this arrangement, they would rise up in a cataclysmic movement of revolution and overthrow the bourgeoisie that would mark the end of class struggle. Now, part and parcel of scientific socialism was equal rights for men and women. Thus, some women became significant Marxist leaders during this time. In Germany, Clara Zetkin led the charge against the privileges of the bourgeoisie and worked on reform on behalf of women. And then over in Poland, Rosa Luxemburg worked to secure rights for the working class and even led a revolution, a failed one, but a revolution nonetheless in 1918. And the final ideology for change that you need to know is anarchism. The idea here is that all forms of governmental authority were unnecessary and should be overthrown or replaced with a society based on voluntary cooperation. Over in Russia, Mikhail Bakunin became the poster boy for anarchism. He was a Russian revolutionary who argued that secret societies ought to lead revolutionary movements to destroy the state and replace it with self-governing workplaces and communes. Over in France, Georges Sorel worked along a similar vein. He taught that once people rose up and destroyed the governing authorities, that all property should then be transferred to labor unions. And the French word for labor union is syndicat, which is why Sorel's teaching became known as syndicalism. Okay, click right here to keep reviewing for Unit 6 of AP Euro. And click right here to get my AP Euro review pack if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.